This is a production of Cornell University.
Sure. Thanks, everybody. The 20th episode of the Cornell Turf Show we're going to go through here today. Thanks, everybody, for sticking with us during the spring. Great feedback. So we appreciate everybody attending live, watching after the fact, or listening. Today's guest, Dr. Roch Gaussoin, University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Roch's here today. We're going to talk about some aeration. It may get controversial. We don't know. We'll see. But we've been itching to have this conversation for a couple weeks now. So we're glad to get Roch on the show here. But as always, Frank, we'll transition to you with your news and notes from the past week.
All right. Thanks, Carl. So good to have everybody here. And you know, Jeff Stone and the guys at the Ocean Course at Kiawah Island, big shout out to the second major of the year, the crew. You know, it's always great. And I noticed the great sky that you get down there in the low country. I believe this is the low country. And then one of my favorite golf courses in the world is this Mackenzie little gem in Adelaide, Australia, that this picture showed up on Twitter, not only with a beautiful sky, but, you know, among my most favorite things to do other than yak with my esteemed colleague from Nebraska is to ride trains. And there's a train that goes right through the heart of this golf course. And it's a very unique experience for the person spraying on the left there, enjoying a train going by. You know, lots of stuff in the social media world. I spend and have had to spend my time on a new account in Twitter because I got hacked and I started selling sunglasses for a short period of time. But I always marvel at how superintendents just notice little things, and even the crew members, you know, talking about how, you know, the simple task of raking a bunker can, you know, bring a lot of well-being. And, you know, as my pal Paul McCormick would say, some peacefulness or mindfulness in doing these tasks. And I think that gets lost a lot of times in the hustle bustle. And of course you can't, Carl, it's our last show, right? So I got to show the cute dog pictures, right? And then all the stupid stuff. This Isaac Brewer, this was a great one. The Twitter picture cropped it. He goes, new water feature on 14. So I'm looking at this thing, Carl, and I'm saying, oh, there's these rocks. So it's probably a riprap picture or something. And then you scan back and there's this poor guy trying to fix a leak on the side of the fairway. And for those of you that just can't get enough of looking at my face, Carl face, our voices, we've got the YouTube channel that's, you know, we've got to be setting records, Carl, for throwing all kinds of baloney out there from the Land Grant Institution here in New York, as well as a podcast, right? We take this and put it in another format for those of people who just like to listen to it in their head. Now, Carl, as I pass it back to you, just a reminder to everybody, we're going to be back with some webinars over the next couple of months. I know it seems weird to be doing it during the summer, but we're going to try to get some content on screen with our colleague, Rick Slattery, who's working with us on this program in partnership with the Rochester Institute of Technology, the Golisano Sustainability Institute. And Carl, you know, the sustainability website is up there now. People can sign up and get the emails. And of course, everybody wants a poster, Carl. We want people to start sending pictures of their face like this with the poster to the show. Let's get an email account and see if we can get somebody to outdo you with that grin on your face. So Carl, what's the tip for the week?
Yeah, so we've been doing this now for 11 weeks, Frank, and each week we've been taking one of these, aspects of the poster, one of these BMPs, kind of blowing them out and looking at them. But today, in kind of a prelude to the talk we'll have with Roch, I wanted to talk about one of the concepts that kind of flows through the whole poster, which is determining why you do everything. We use all these tools, you know, for example, in the irrigation system. Why do we irrigate? Well, we use a soil moisture meter. We can use our eyes, look for wilt. We can use ET data. All this drives why we irrigate. Same thing with fertilizer, right? If we're trying to grow the grass, we should kind of know how much the grass is growing. That goes back to clipping volume, visually assessing the turf, how much it's growing. And then pest control too. So why do we control pests? Well, presumably we're scouting to see if the pest is there. We're using maybe some risk models, dollar spy, anthracnose, brown patch models we got on our website. So we're using all these things to determine why we're going to do something. And today, while we don't have anything like this on the poster, we're going to talk about aeration. Roch, you had a great tweet the other day, informed decisions versus that's what we've always done. And knowing why you're going to do something is important. And you should be able to explain why. When we talk about aeration, there's a bunch of things listed here. I could have listed a bunch more, but why are you doing it? And it's important to think about that before you go and do it and say, oh, well, it lists, these are the 8 things that it does for me. Well, what are you really trying to do? So knowing why, we'll get into this later, Frank, but being able to explain why, sometimes through data, having some metrics is what you should be doing before you do any practice.
Yeah, and I think that's just good best management practice no matter what you're doing, whether it's for water quality protection or managing organic matter. Thanks for that, Carl. So let's take a little trip through the weather. Unfortunately, I'm out in the West Coast this week, so I unfortunately didn't set my alarm. I missed my conference call this morning where Art usually gives me a good weather report. So I'm going to see what kind of meteorologist I can be on the fly. And so the first thing I'd start with, because I'm, growing grass too back east, is the last month has felt fairly wet, but the last week, especially for many, has felt a little bit on the dry side. We're not getting the amount of rainfall we've been getting. Looks like warm temperatures are coming for the next 8 to 14 days. Looks like it's likely to be dry or at least normal for some in the next 5 days, and normal precip or maybe even above normal on the longer look, but maybe there's not a lot of confidence in these things, right? That's the trick to forecasting. One of the things that I just want to draw your attention to, because we won't see you now or talk to you now for a while as you go off to grow grass for the season. The dollar spot forecast model we use on the website is still a good tool to add to your toolbox of thinking about how you're going to make those fairway sprays, right? Those large acreage sprays for this particular thing. The better you can predict and model, a day here, a day here, a day here, a day there, changing the interval a little bit, altering the rate. All those practices, you can look at them in an immediate and an acute level in the model. And also Art and the guys at the Climate Center have built these other forecasts where you can see what's happened in the past and the path moving forward. So I'd encourage you to add this to the links on your phone, as well as any other tools. There's lots of them out there. Certainly Greenkeeper and playbooks have put in the dollar spot risk model. So we're talking soil today. And again, I think we were in a stall, and I think the rubber band is about to let go. We're going to accelerate out of this stall now and really start to get in earnest into the growing season. And you can see the response in the soil temperatures recently now well into the 60s, particularly in the metro New York area, around the urban centers somewhere in upstate New York, a little cooler in the higher elevations, but still well into the 50s, where these roots are cranking and grass should be growing well. Now, typically, we try to remind everybody, because a lot of times in the spring, this is when you make these drench applications for these root pathogens that are certainly among the toughest things to control that we have out there. And we talk about it ad nauseum out here on the show. And I'll just remind everybody, check this publication. You can go to the Wisconsin website. Carl, put the Wisconsin website thing in the chat, or make sure we put it up there so people can go and access this publication online. Check out the efficacy data. It's from 2020. They do it every couple of years. But this edition on the right here of all these mixes, right? This is what took a little extra time, because the pathologists really spent some time looking at all the new mixes have come out, right? A lot of companies coming out with mixes. There's not a lot of new molecules. There's some. So what they're doing is they're doing these blendings, and then the generic companies are doing the blendings that are unique to them. They're mixing active ingredients in there. And again, with the wide range of efficacy among these products, number one, use them right. Number two, pay attention to the frac code. Well, the last thing we need is getting involved in resistance management of these things, in addition to the fact that we can't get the darn fungicide down to the organism where the roots are deeper without a fair amount of irrigation that nobody likes. So just a reminder about John Inguigiato's work at the University of Connecticut. We've had Johnny on the show a couple of times where he's talked about the role of verification in managing take-all patch in particular, but the rules would still apply for summer patch. And he's done some work looking at none, solid, and hollow timing and timing of the aerification, the addition or non-addition of manganese. Just a good, nice transition to, the conversation that comes up every spring. I think I used this slide a bunch of weeks ago when, you could hear the engines roar in spring. And if you look in the background here, you can see the trees are just leafing out in a lot of these pictures, right? I mean, this is early season, right? Then the sand starts flying. We start burying everything. we got John's work with the Rutgers stuff that shows, the role of top dressing in managing certain stresses here, like anthracnose. It doesn't eliminate it, but it certainly provides that protection. Of course, Roch, you and I have chatted about this more times than probably either of us want to admit to, but at the core, I think of what you've taught, really led the industry on over the last decade or so, has been about the relationship between managing organic matter and getting the water through that profile, which certainly is part and parcel to getting fungicides down there as well. Now, of course, that starts with sampling, right? This was really what I thought. I used to sit around, you and I used to argue about on this on PTI, and I would sit there and listen. I'm like, yeah, I mean, if you can't get a good number, I mean, we were yakking about this 10 years ago. If you can't get a good number, how do you know where and how and what you're managing, right? And then it's okay, what's the number? And then what the hell do I do? There's 15 million ways to put a piece of metal in the ground, right? And water injection cultivation has gone by the wayside. Now you hear guys talking about surface area impacted, right? That's a common mantra I hear when I visit guys. Oh, I've impacted about 13% or 20%. I've gone out 5 times, right? And now we're questioning, Micah Woods, I know you've commented on this. Micah's suggesting this different approach to sampling. Carl's done some work playing around with the relationship between traffic levels potentially and organic matter. And, we make a reach with this for sure. We admit it, right, Carl? So, and then there's all these new tools, right? The dry jack, the turf topper, I think, which seems to be a similar thing to the dry jack, where you're doing water injection cultivation and injecting sand in the hole. So I got a bunch of simple questions here we're going to get to, but here's the one I actually want to start with. This is what I was going to ask you when we were bugging you a while ago, Roch. It's spring in the north. Greens are great coming out of the winter. They're firming up nice from these early season practices guys are getting good at. We got good sands now. We test that stuff. Golfers are raving about condition. The next day, the greens are hollow-tined and buried in sand. Why mess up good greens with spring cultivation?
Frank, that's a great question, and it's interesting to watch how we've gone along from, actually 73. Jim Beard says, "Hey, top dressing is the best way to control organic matter," and then we get into these really elaborate schemes, right? And nothing wrong with them; they all have their twists and all kinds of new devices and everything. But I've had the same question, because I think often I think we need aeration in the beginning of the season, but not like immediately, because the grass is ready to go, right? And we're taking advantage. And especially this year, it looked like your data was similar. I took a look at some of your previous data. We had this warming trend, and then the bottom dropped out, right? And we saw lots of injury. We had 28 degrees after people had already started mowing, and for the Great Plains, that's pretty catastrophic, and a lot of weird discoloration, and everyone was reaching for fungicides, mostly homeowners, but they're like, hey, well, how do I control this whitening of the leaf? And it looks like ascochyta and blah, blah. And so I'm not convinced that we should be jumping on the aeration, but I do believe it's because of players, right? Because our play goes down, we get a jump of play, and then they're trying to I think the superintendent's trying to take advantage of that little gap in play before it really hits the season. But is that agronomically sound? It seems to me that we could get some play on it. And I know the guys that top dress as a means for winter management, right? They put a bunch of top dressing sand on there, that they pretty much drag that in with sand reels and maybe do a little spiking or something like that to get it in. But those guys don't normally go, especially out in Western Nebraska, they don't normally go with a real aggressive coring. Matter of fact, a lot of them aren't even pulling a core anymore at all, right?
Okay, wait, we're going to get to that. So let me interrupt here and ask, get into the heart of it. Number one, you're right. If you don't time spring air, if you think you need spring aerification, whether it's hollow tine or solid tine, and you do it at a time that you don't get active growth, you're staring at pretty bad looking holes, bumpy greens for a couple of weeks. That's what you're describing there. Yeah. That's number one, what aggravates the golfers further, because I also hear guys that wait and they're like, Frank, look what I just did. It was 6 days ago and they're completely covered. Because if you hit the growth potential right, right? They're filled back in. But here's the thing I want to have a laugh about. I say, okay, so what if you didn't do it? They're like, oh, I'm going to get play. I got to do it. Well, what if you didn't do it? Oh. And so, okay, if top dressing is the way I manage organic matter, and I got sands integrated into the organic matter, I got my numbers at like 2%, like most guys who are still worried. And they're saying, oh, if I don't do it, it feels like it's like jumping off a cliff or something. Whoa, here I go. No spring aerification, no parachute. Tell me, how do we ease that for people? How do we tell them really, you probably, if you really got to do something, get a really thin needle and just go up and down quick. And I don't know. How do you want to answer that?
No, and once again, another great idea. And I'm convinced that we pull for aggressive aerification. If the green has problems and they need, 5, 6, 7, who knows what the magic number is. You and I have talked about that there is really no magic number. But if they're down around 2, 2.5, which is what we see as a routine average on greens that are managed, moderately well, right? I mean, not all across, and Doug Lindy's work shows that, and the USGA work shows that. So let's quit obsessing about a number and then not worry about it in the spring. You can do needle tines, you can do bayonet tines, you can do these less aggressive aerification, get sand into the profile without, 5/8 tines when we are questioning whether the grass is going to grow yet. Wow. I just don't get that. I struggle with that.
All right. So let's take this a little bit at a time here and go back to some of the questions that I listed here. First off, it's the number, right? The interesting evolution of this now seems to be, well, maybe we need the number more at the surface, right? You questioned this immediately when you did your research years ago, right?
Right.
Where do we sample from? So now the question's coming again. And so for now, what's the best method in your mind that's going to give superintendents actionable data? What is the kind of actionable sample data they can get from sampling? Do you like the undisturbed core just in the top 3 centimeters? Do you think it's just maybe should start getting these OM 246 numbers to see if they tell us anything, right? I'm not presuming they can tell us anything yet, but what do you think?
Well, no, and Michael Woods popularized the sectionalized sampling. It's not new. I mean, people have been doing it. Some of the labs do that, et cetera, et cetera. But he gave it a nice hashtag and, rolls it to the surface. And now we have an opportunity to look at that. And, clearly, and the USGA, Dave Otis, who's now retired from the USGA, he's like, yeah, I worry about what's in, that little, the inch. If I'm squeezing water at that, 24 hours after an irrigation, that's a problem. So really, maybe we need to concentrate on that. I don't think the data is clear on that yet. And I did want an opportunity to talk about the USGA. They're calling it the brain trust. I'm not sure with me being on that counts. But, it's me, Doug Soldat, Doug Lindy, Jim Murphy, and we are all doing this. We did a lit review and we found out all the gaps in sampling. And then Doug is starting to receive samples from us to look at that first inch and whether we can consistently sample and whether we leave the verdure on and off. And, the USGA is generously, well, not generously, they're sort of funding it, but, we are getting some dollars for it to pay the bills.
Yeah, you still got the guy. You still got the Godfather in there somehow.
Hey, I'm going to take that, right? Payola is a good thing.
That's right. All right. So
the bottom line is, Frank, is that I think we're going to quit thinking like farmers and come up with a sampling technique that makes sense for golf greens specific or sports turf, right? And maybe how we sample by depth and I think you'll see that within a year, we will have that either in the green section or some publication where we'll say a standardized method for sampling golf greens, because we needed that. We needed that 20 years ago.
Hello. Yeah, I can't wait. So let's ask the next question because, okay, we're going to have numbers in a couple of years. If you and I are still at this, we'll come back. There'll be some numbers. We'll be able to have targets. Maybe it'll matter from that perspective, how to calibrate this use of sand, right? So What about what you revealed when you looked back and said, if you put enough sand down matched to your growth, you're pretty good. So what do you think about what do you say to people now that are considering eliminating cultivation in many ways and just going with growth-driven top dressing, which to me implies they're collecting clippings, they're monitoring their organic matter, and they're adding sand accordingly versus having to make a hole and put the sand in. What are your thoughts? It was a pain in the butt when you did it, right? This harkens back to your work.
No, it was hard to sell. Number one, when we showed that solid tines are just as good as hollow, and people started saying, "Well, what about compaction? You're not removing any material. You're not removing that. Even when people say 20%, those holes fill up with organic matter, right? So I struggle with that all the time. But at the same time, I'm just not convinced that we can't manage organic matter. We're not talking about compaction. Sands don't readily compact. We're talking about that top inch or top 2 inches, whatever we come up with.
That's why we build them out of these things. That's why Norm Hummel made a damn career out of this, because we engineered the damn sands. We
to keep sand, to keep moisture off the surface, and the organic matter compromises that. So manage the organic matter so that it doesn't stay at the surface, firm and fast or high and dry, whatever buzzword you want to use or hashtag you want to use. But do we need cultivation for that? I'm not convinced. And I think we need the top dressing. I know some of my very respected superintendents out there are like, hey, we don't need to top dress, or they're top dressing minimally. But you need some sand on the surface, and you need to keep the surface firm and fast, right?
So but the idea now is, if I can really keep growth to a minimum, heavy trim-it use and new, you name it, the PGR, we get a little nervous when they drive the end down low. But we know they keep the putting surfaces dry at a very high level. They'll try to keep them as dry as possible. So they've got everything they can do to ratchet down growth. Again, it drives, it's two things. Number one, it's they don't recover as well from traffic, and that's where I want to go next. But also, if they're not growing, maybe they don't need as much sand.
No, but I think people are getting really good at not putting on as much sand. When we look at surveys that Paul Vermillion did 30 years ago. And there were areas putting on 60 to 80 cubic yards on an end, down in Florida and stuff. And now we see people in the 10 to 20 range. Our recommendation in generic terms was around 18 to 22, right? I think we're lower than we were. And when you look at the early recommendations, they were 20 to 60 cubic yards. I mean, that's what is it, 20 or is it 60?
Okay. So can you give me, I really appreciated the USGA's, or this method they've come up with the sheet pan and the mat on top to figure out depth. I want to know, it's like, I finally figured out why I don't entirely understand top dressing, other than I'm an idiot. I need somebody to tell me how much depth you put on every year. I remember when the Pacific Northwest guys were doing the worm work years ago. Right? God rest his soul, Paul Backman, I think, did some of that work where they were putting on a half an inch a year on the fairways, right? Roch, remember that?
Oh, yeah.
So what is 30? I mean, when I try to think about this, what are some targets that guys are adding in depths in your mind over the course of a year? 30 versus 60 cubic yards.
Yeah. So, we know our work at 20. We've got this measured as actually what happened. You're putting on at 20, 18 to 20, you're putting on about 0.6 to 1.2 centimeters, about a half an inch a year.
Okay.
Yeah.
At that rate. Okay. So here's the question now, since we brought it up. What about traffic? Carl's really been fussing around with this, looking at organic matter levels in our, putting greens on these state park golf courses, and he's getting more extensive this year doing it. What do you make of that? What do you make of the impact, and why would traffic reduce organic matter?
Well, I think we actually shear roots and we physically kill it, right? For lack of a better term. And I know that when we look at courses that have 60 to 80,000 rounds versus courses that have 30, they consistently have less organic matter. And then when we sample in approaches or entry exit points on a green, those can be down 1%. And then the rest of the green is at 3 to 3.5. Traffic does, so more rounds. I like the graph you showed of Carl's work. It's because clearly there's less organic matter when you traffic it more. I wonder, what about triplex versus walk behinds? There's a lot of opportunity here for data-driven science, but who's going to do it?
Well, that's right. And I can tell you, sometimes necessity is the mother of invention. I'm talking to our pal Dan Dinelli, and he says, I got sick of the mower on the approach, the triplex in the approach. So I told the fiveplex guy to just drive up there, don't drive on the green, figure out how to swoop through. And he swears the approaches got firmer. He swears that there's less top dressing needed. So listen, let's stop here. Carl, I'm sure this is usually a lively topic. This gets usually people at least a question or two. How about you? Comments or questions for Roch?
Yeah, you know, the one thing when we talk about traffic, I think with golfers, we normally think of just walking or push card, walk on off, walk off. What we've been doing, Frank, is we've been looking at trying to estimate how many pitch marks basically a golfer will make over the course of a round. And, you know, based on how big the green is and how many golfers are going through, you could see on average between 3 and 8% of your surface on a whole green impacted by a pitch mark in a given year. So basically, you know, diameter of the ball, you know, how many pitch marks per round, blah, blah, blah. But that's probably a significant impact on traffic too. And I don't think we think about that until we see all the unfixed pitch marks. People put the flags out, they do the little demonstration. So maybe just a PSA for your golfers to fix their pitch marks. Maybe that'll help out.
Amen to that.
So we did have a couple questions from Vitas. One, he's asking about sand top dressing leading to hydrophobicity. And any ever concerns there, Roch or Frank?
Yeah, of course.
Well, and I think it's, you know, when we try to keep them drier, you know, the drier you keep any sand, the potential for, you know, then they start repelling sand. So I think the answer is it possible to keep greens too dry, you know, even if you're keeping them alive? And I've seen greens in that condition. And then when they're trying to wet them up, you know, they're getting ready for a tournament or whatever. When they're trying to wet them up, they don't wet up, right? Or you can actually see the water repealing off the surface, and then they go pound them with wetting agents. And we don't have time to have a conversation about wetting agents, but you know, clearly they find a way to get water into the surface. So yeah, the question is, or the answer is yes, that the drier you keep sands, the more apt they are to be hydrophobic.
Exactly right. And you're exactly right, Roch. The wetting agent hole is one I went down a little bit with Glenn O'Beer earlier this year, and it still remains a very personal thing for every superintendent. Other questions, Carl?
Yeah, Vitas was also asking loss on ignition, combustion testing. I know, Roch, you're probably playing around. I think the temperatures of what they were burning, the organic matter samples, is maybe changing. I don't know if you've solidified that with this USGA work or if that's something you're investigating as well.
Yeah.
So that's a great question. And I think it was one that was created because people found out that they are fired at different temperatures. You know, calcareous temperatures do respond differently, but the temperature that we've came about based on all the data that was out there, and there's a fair amount of data in agricultural soils and to a limited extent, you know, we came up with a temperature, and when we release the specs, we'll have a range, but within that range, you're fine. But this obsession with the temperature, I think, was predicated on people looking for something to question, right? I think we've solidified a temperature. The whole sampling depth and how you sample and leaving the verdure on or off, we'll try to finalize that, but I think we've got a temperature that's solid, and we can trust that 99.9% of the greens that are sampled that are sand based, that'll give you a reasonable estimate of using LOI.
All right, so last question from me, Roch, before we wrap up here is these new tools, what I call new tools, right? I've been a big fan of the dry jack, mostly because I was a big fan of the hydrojack before that got pulled. And it seemed to me, man, putting the sand in a water injection hole that does its thing, boy, that feels good, because I know your data also revealed that. But, you know, honestly, I can't say I've seen data, but I've walked on greens where guys have gotten on these programs, and man, it seems that works. Now, the other, I will call a new tool, is the Air 2G. I know Johnny Sorokin's been playing around with that, talking about a little short-lived. You know, we have this continued obsession for new tools on sand-based greens. And I got to tell you, pal, I haven't reconciled why we need to have all these tools when we build these things, design these things to resist the compaction beyond just targeted spots like Carl talks about, walk on, walk off, or, you know, where you had to put the cup a lot, where you get a lot of foot traffic, that kind of thing. What are your thoughts about new tools, the need for any tools, and why bother when you got sand-based greens?
Well, no, and I think when we see the hydrojet most effective is courses that have not consistently top dressed, and superintendents have changed, a lot of turnover, and I think I think they work amazing, right? Because they get a lot of sand into the profile. They're less disruptive than once again, my least favorite tine is the 5/8, right? And I mean, why go that big? Go big or go home. No, I don't think you need that. But anyway, so I've seen greens really torn up and heaved when they use so. But if you've got a green that's been compromised by layering and excessive nitrogen, so you get those multiple grow-in layers, even though the greens were built 30 years ago, right? You get that, cake. Steve Keeley, layers are for cakes, not for greens, right? And there's some amazing pictures on Twitter of people showing 20, 21, 20, 40, whatever year greens. So I'm not sure. I think they really work great in those arenas. And then as a management tool with a little less aggressive approach. And, the guys that run that company do a really good job. I don't know anything about the Air 2G. I know a little bit about it. Yeah. I know like Johnny's work in sports turf, is clearly showing some benefits, but are they long-term or not? And he himself has said that. So just like you said, but I'm not sure for the general day-to-day operations of a green that's been managed, what we would say, quote unquote, correctly, that's not layered and doesn't have an excessive organic matter, whether we just can't do. My favorite is needle tines in the quadratine set, right? And just poke holes and throw sand.
And no one noticed. No one even knew you were there.
No, that you could, if you put just a minimal sand on, you can water it in and nobody knows you're there, right?
Exactly right.
And no disruption. Yeah.
You're the man. Disruption. So great to see you. We're at the witching hour, Carl, for the end of our season, man. 11 weeks. Woof. It's not only the fastest 30 minutes, it's the fastest 11 weeks. We are bending the space-time continuum, Carl.
Yep. Thanks everybody for joining us. We'll have one more episode tomorrow with Chase Straw. We'll talk about some remote sensing on sports turf. But Roch, again, thanks for the time today.
Happy to finally get it done.
All right, Roch.
Yep. We'll see everybody tomorrow. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much. Take care. Appreciate it.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.